The house was quiet in the way that old houses get quiet. Not peaceful, but heavy. Like the walls themselves had absorbed too many years of silence and couldn't hold any more. It was a Tuesday evening in October 2005, and Raymond Calloway was doing what he always did when the weather turned cold and the night stretched long. He was sorting through boxes. Not because anything needed sorting. Not because he was moving or decluttering or following some organizational system his late wife had once tried to teach him. He sorted through boxes because it gave his hands something to do while his mind went to the places it always eventually went. Raymond was 63 years old. He had the kind of face that told a story without saying a word. Deep lines carved into his forehead, gray stubble that he shaved only when someone reminded him, and eyes that were still sharp, still searching, even after all these years. Especially after all these years. The box he reached for that evening was labeled in faded black marker, Melissa, school stuff. He hadn't opened it in at least a decade, maybe longer. He recognized his wife Carol's handwriting on the label, and for a moment he just held the box in his lap, sitting on the edge of the guest bed in a room that used to be his daughter's room, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight, but the other kind. He opened it slowly. There were report cards inside, a ribbon from a sophomore English competition, a handmade birthday card that Melissa had made for him when she was 9, the letters spelling out Happy Birthday Dad in purple crayon, the misspelling so perfectly hers that it made his chest tighten. There were drawings from her younger years, a friendship bracelet, a journal she had kept briefly at 16 and then abandoned. He had never read it, had never allowed himself to, and a small envelope of photographs from a school trip to Washington, D.C. that she had taken the spring before she disappeared. And then, near the bottom, a Yearbook. He almost didn't pick it up. He'd been through this box before, years ago, after Carol passed, and he remembered the Yearbook being in there. Harwick Senior High School, 1984 to 1985. Melissa's junior year, the last normal year. He had flipped through it once before, a long time ago, and it had been too much. He had put it back and not touched the box again for years. But tonight, for some reason, he picked it up. He ran his hand over the cover. The school's logo was printed in blue and gold. A river and a bridge, the town's symbol. The laminate was cracked to the corners. He opened it. He flipped through the front pages slowly. Student council photos. The prom committee. A photo of the gymnasium decorated for homecoming. He was almost mechanical about it, his brain half present, half somewhere in 1985. Then he turned to the senior class photos. He paused there. Melissa had been a junior when she disappeared. She never made it to senior year, never got her senior portrait taken, never walked across a stage in a cap and gown. He turned past the seniors to the junior class section and found her the way he always found her in his memory. Immediately, without searching, the way you always find the face you love most in any crowd. There she was, 17 years old, hair loose over her shoulders, dark and thick the way Carol's had been. That slight gap between her front teeth that she had stopped being embarrassed about somewhere around 15, deciding it was interesting rather than a flaw. Her eyes looking straight into the camera with that particular quality of self-possession she had always carried, the kind of confidence that wasn't arrogance but was something quieter and more permanent. He touched the photo with one finger. He sat with it for a long moment. Then he turned the page, and his hands stopped. He stared. He blinked. Looked away. Looked back. His breath left his body in a slow, confused exhale. And his hands, the hands that had built furniture and repaired engines and held his dying wife's palm in a hospital room, those hands began to shake. Because there, on the opposite page, in a different section entirely, was a photograph that made no sense. A girl. Same eyes. Same jaw. Same slight tilt of the head. The way Melissa always tilted her head in photographs because she said the camera made her nose look bigger if she faced it straight on. But the name beneath the photo wasn't Melissa. And the section it appeared in, the class year printed at the top of the page, was wrong. It was off. It didn't match. It was the senior class section. The class of 1986. The school year that began 3 weeks after Melissa vanished. Raymond Calloway sat in his dead daughter's bedroom, in a house full of 20 years of silence, holding a yearbook that seemed to be telling him something impossible. He didn't move for a very long time, and that was only the beginning. To understand what that photograph meant, to understand why Raymond's hands were shaking, why his heart was hammering against his ribs like something trying to get out, you have to go back. You have to go back to the summer of 1985, to a small town called Hawick, Ohio, to a neighborhood of maple-lined streets and front porches, to a house on Cloverdale Road where a 17-year-old girl named Melissa Calloway was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like the world was a little more interesting than they had realized. Melissa was going to be a senior in September. She had plans, real, specific, research plans. The kind that teenagers make when they are actually serious about their futures and not just performing seriousness for the benefit of adults. She wanted to study journalism. She had already written to 3 universities requesting admissions information. She kept a folder in her desk drawer with brochures and handwritten notes comparing tuition costs and program rankings. And Raymond had looked through that folder once when she wasn't home and felt a kind of pride that sat so deep in his chest it almost hurt. She was the editor of the school newspaper, the Hawick Current, a position she had campaigned for with a quiet intensity that had impressed even the faculty advisor, a man named Mr. Parisi who was not easily impressed. She wrote with a clarity and a directness that felt older than 17. Not pretentious, not performing sophistication, but genuinely incisive in the way that some people just naturally are with words. She had broken a small story the previous spring about the school district's misallocation of student activity funds, a story that had made the local paper and had resulted in a formal review. She was 17 years old and she had already made something matter. She had a best friend named Donna Richter who had been her closest companion since the 9th grade. The kind of friendship built on shared humor and late-night phone calls and a mutual understanding so complete that they could communicate entire paragraphs with a single look. She had a boyfriend, briefly, in the spring of her junior year, a boy named Marcus Webb who played guitar in a band that rehearsed in his parents' garage and who was, by all accounts, kind and genuine, though the relationship had ended amicably in June. More from a natural drift of 2 people heading in different directions than from any real conflict. Her relationship with her father was the kind that gets romanticized in hindsight, but was genuinely, truly close. Raymond worked at the plant, sheet metal fabrication, and he worked long hours, but Saturdays were his and Melissa's day. They went to the hardware store together, which sounds unremarkable, but Melissa made every trip into something. She asked questions about everything. She had started, in the last year or 2, asking him questions about his life before she was born, about his own father, about what Hawick had looked like when he was young, about whether he had ever thought about doing something other than what he did. Raymond, who had never thought of himself as a man with particularly interesting answers, found himself giving them anyway, drawn out by the quality of her attention. He adored her. That is not too strong a word. Carol Calloway, Melissa's mother, was quieter than her daughter but loved her with the same intensity. She was the one who stayed up late when Melissa was working on a deadline for the school paper, bringing tea to the desk without being asked. She was the one who listened to every story Melissa brought home, remembered every name, every detail, asked follow-up questions a week later. Carol kept a journal of her daughter going back to Melissa's early childhood. Not just the funny sayings and milestone moments, but the harder things too. The times Melissa had struggled, the times she had surprised herself, the texture of who she was becoming. On the morning of August 14th, 1985, Melissa Calloway ate breakfast, toast and orange juice, kissed her mother on the cheek, told her father she was meeting Donna at the library to work on a feature story she was planning for the first issue of the Hawick Current in September. She had her notebook with her, a blue canvas bag over one shoulder. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt and jeans. She told Raymond she would be home by 4. She said it the way people say things when they fully intend to keep the promise. Offhand, certain, already thinking about the next thing. She walked down the porch steps. She waved at Mr. DeLuca next door, who was watering his roses. She turned left on Cloverdale Road. She never came back. Donna Richter was at the library all morning. Melissa never arrived. Donna assumed something had come up at home. Melissa would have called if she could, and went home at noon, mildly puzzled but not alarmed. She thought about calling but decided to wait. She figured Melissa would call her. By 4 o'clock, when Melissa hadn't come home, Carol Calloway called Donna's house. By 4:30, she had called 3 other families. By 5, Raymond was in his truck, driving every street between Cloverdale Road and the library on 5th Avenue. By 6 o'clock, the calls to the police had been made and 2 officers were at the house on Cloverdale Road, sitting at the kitchen table with notepads, asking questions in the careful, preliminary way of people who have not yet decided whether this is serious. By the time the sun went down on August 14, 1985, Raymond Calloway knew, not in any way he could have articulated to the officers sitting in his kitchen, not in any way that would have satisfied an evidence standard, but in the deep, wordless way that parents know things about their children, that something was very wrong. By nightfall, panic had replaced hope. The Harwick Police Department in 1985 was not, by any objective measure, equipped for a case like this. Harwick had a population of just under 12,000. It was the kind of town where the biggest crime stories of any given year involved property theft, maybe a bar fight that went too far. The department had 14 officers, 1 detective, a man named Frank Dutton who had transferred from a suburb of Columbus 8 years earlier and who was, by most accounts, competent enough for what Harwick usually needed. Detective Dutton was the one who came to the Calloway house that first night. He was a lean man in his 40s with a careful way of speaking that Raymond would come to associate with a particular kind of professional distance, the kind that protects people who see bad things regularly from feeling those things too deeply. Raymond understood it, on some level. He just couldn't afford to extend the same protection to himself. Dutton asked all the right questions. When did she leave? Who was she supposed to meet? Had there been any arguments at home recently? Any changes in behavior? Any new relationships her parents didn't know about? He wrote everything in a small notebook with a blue pen. He was professional. He was calm. And Raymond, watching him write, felt something in his stomach that he couldn't name yet. A premonition. Maybe. That calm was the wrong register for this. The first 48 hours were dense with activity. Officers canvassed the neighborhood. Donna Richter was interviewed. She was devastated, barely coherent through her crying, insisting over and over that Melissa had been completely normal, completely herself, the last time they had spoken. Mr. DeLuca confirmed he had seen Melissa walking down Cloverdale Road at approximately 9 in the morning. That established when she left. No one could establish anything after that. Marcus Webb, the former boyfriend, was interviewed. He had an alibi. He had been working a summer job at a hardware store on the other side of town, and 3 co-workers confirmed he had been there all day. The library on 5th Avenue had no record of Melissa entering that morning. Bus drivers on the route she might have taken were interviewed. None remembered her. Melissa had simply stepped off Cloverdale Road and ceased to exist. Within the first week, a theory emerged from within the department, not officially stated, not written into any report in those exact words, but communicated through tone and the shifting quality of the questions being asked. The theory was that Melissa had run away. She was 17, the theory went. Old enough to have private plans, private problems, private reasons. Maybe the breakup with a boyfriend wasn't as amicable as everyone thought. Maybe there were pressures about college, about the future. Maybe there was something the parents didn't know. This was not a theory that Raymond and Carol could accept. She had everything to stay for, Raymond told Dutton, in a conversation he would replay in his mind for the next 2 decades. She had her newspaper. She had her college plans. She had her whole senior year ahead of her. She told me she'd be home by 4. Melissa kept her word. That was who she was. Dutton had nodded in that careful way of his. He had not said, "We believe you," he had said. "We're looking at every possibility." That was the sentence that began Raymond's mistrust of the official investigation. He started his own search. He put up flyers, hundreds of them, then thousands. He drove to towns 30 and 40 miles away and plastered telephone poles and bulletin boards. He placed ads in newspapers. He called shelters, hospitals, churches, campgrounds within a 100-mile radius. He contacted every missing persons organization he could find. There were few of them in 1985. The infrastructure for this kind of search barely existed. And he stayed in contact with each one, calling back every few weeks with updated information, making sure Melissa's case didn't slide off anyone's list. There were tips. There were reported sightings. In Michigan, in Kentucky, in Pennsylvania. Every single one was followed up. Every single one led nowhere. Within 3 months, the official investigation had effectively stalled. Dutton moved to other cases. The file on Melissa Calloway remained technically open but practically dormant, visited occasionally when a new tip came in, which happened less and less as the months became years. But Raymond kept searching, and one small detail from that first week, a detail that Dutton had noted and then apparently set aside, sat buried in the case file for 2 decades, unexamined, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Time does not stop for grief. This is the cruelest thing about it. The world just keeps going. The sun rises. School years begin and end. The September that should have been Melissa's senior year arrives and passes without her. Her classmates graduate in the spring of 1986. Donna Richter walks across the stage in cap and gown, and Raymond knows this because he drives past the school that evening without intending to, without being able to explain why, and sees the parking lot full of cars and the gymnasium lit up through the high windows. He sits in his truck for a minute and then drives home. Melissa would have turned 18 in June of 1986. She would have started university that fall. She would have graduated in 1990. She would have been 25 in 1993, 30 in 1998. Raymond tracked these milestones the way some people track the progress of a wound, not because it helped, but because he couldn't stop. She aged in his mind whether he wanted her to or not. He couldn't freeze her at 17 any more than he could freeze the clock. She kept growing in his imagination, kept becoming the woman she would have been. And the gap between that imagined woman and the terrible absence in the real world was something he carried in his body like an injury that never quite healed. In 1988, Carol Calloway had what the doctors called a breakdown, which is one of those clinical words that smooths over something much rougher and more honest. She had been holding herself together with a determination that Raymond recognized as both admirable and unsustainable, and one morning in February she simply could not get out of bed, and she did not get out of bed for 3 weeks, and after that she was different. Not destroyed. Carol was stronger than that, but altered in some permanent way, as if certain load-bearing parts of her had been redistributed to compensate for what she was carrying. She started seeing a therapist. She started attending a support group for parents of missing children that met at the Methodist Church on Thursday evenings. She started, slowly and painfully, building a version of herself that could exist in a world where Melissa was gone and the questions had no answers. Raymond could not do that. He admired Carol for it. He supported her completely. But he could not lay down the search, could not build a version of himself that made peace with not knowing. It was not stubbornness. Exactly. It was more fundamental than that. It was closer to identity. He learned things, taught himself things, that he never would have known otherwise. He learned how missing persons databases worked and how to cross-reference them. He learned which organizations maintained the most current national records. He learned how to read a police report not just for what it said, but for what it didn't say, for the gaps, the assumptions, the places where a narrative had been accepted too quickly and not re-examined. He drove to Columbus twice, once in 1990, once in 1994, both times to meet with investigators who worked cold cases. Both times he was told, gently but clearly, that without new physical evidence or a credible witness, there was very little that could be done. He was told that the runaway theory, while never proven, could not be definitively ruled out. He drove home both times in silence, the farmland of central Ohio rolling past his windows, flat and wide and patient in a way that felt almost cruel. Carol died in 2001. Her heart, the doctors said, though Raymond had his own private understanding of how hearts can fail for more than one kind of reason. She was 57 years old. She had been a magnificent woman, and she had loved her daughter with everything she possessed, and she had died without an answer. Raymond buried her in Harwick Memorial Cemetery, in a plot next to the space they had left for Melissa, even though there had been no body, no funeral, no confirmed death. Carol had wanted that. She wanted to be next to her daughter's name, even if her daughter's name was on a stone with only a birth year beneath it and nothing after. Raymond stood at Carol's grave in the autumn rain and made a quiet, private promise. He was going to find out what happened. Imagine living every day not knowing if your child is alive or already gone. Imagine every face in every crowd being a potential, terrible hope. Imagine the specific, sustained torture of being unable to grieve fully because grief requires an ending and you have no ending. Imagine watching 20 years pass and knowing that somewhere in those 20 years the truth exists, intact and specific, held in some file cabinet or fading photograph, a human memory that simply hasn't been asked the right question. That was Raymond Calloway's life. And then, on a cold Tuesday evening in October 2005, he reached into a cardboard box and pulled out an old yearbook. He sat with the yearbook closed in his lap for a long time before he trusted himself to look again. He had learned, over 20 years, not to trust his own perception when it came to Melissa. He had seen her face in shopping malls, in parking lots, in the blurry backgrounds of news photographs, in the faces of women on the street who shared some incidental quality, a jawline, a way of moving, a particular tilt of the head. He had learned, painfully and repeatedly, that the mind desperately searching for something will find it in places where it doesn't exist. He knew this about himself. He had compensated for it. He had trained himself to be skeptical of his own hope. So he sat with the closed yearbook and breathed slowly and told himself, look again carefully. Look like a stranger. Look without wanting. He opened it to the page. The section he was looking at was labeled Senior Class, 1985 to 86. The class of 1986. These were students who had been juniors when Melissa was a junior, her classmates, or 1 year ahead of her. Students who had been present in the building the year she disappeared and had then returned in September 1985 to complete their senior year while Melissa was gone. The girl was listed under the name Ellen Marsh. But Raymond's hands were shaking again, because the face in that photograph, the eyes with their particular quality of directness, the set of the jaw, the slight downward tilt of the mouth that Melissa had when she was keeping herself from smiling too wide, the way her right eyebrow sat just a fraction higher than her left, an asymmetry so specific it was almost a signature. That face was his daughter's face. He told himself no. He told himself he was doing the thing he always did. He told himself to be rational. He went back to the box and found a loose photograph, a school photo from the previous year, 1983 to 84, Melissa at 16. He placed it next to the yearbook page. He looked at them side by side under the lamp. His mouth went dry. It was not just a resemblance. It was not grief distorting perception. It was not one of those situations where two strangers happen to share broad features that a desperate mind connects, allowing for the natural changes that occur in a face between 16 and 17, allowing for the different quality of light. The two photographs showed the same person. But here was the thing that elevated this from haunting coincidence to genuine impossibility. Melissa disappeared on August 14, 1985. The senior class section of this yearbook represented students photographed in the fall of 1985. Students who returned to school in September 1985 for their senior year. Melissa had disappeared 3 weeks before that school year began. A girl who looked exactly like her, who by every visible metric might be her had been photographed as a senior at Hawick High School in the fall of 1985. After she disappeared, Raymond sat in the silence of his daughter's old room and felt the ground shift beneath him. He looked at the name again. Ellen Marsh. He had never encountered that name. Not once. In 20 years of searching, in all the databases and directories and tips and cross-reference records. That name had never appeared in any context connected to his daughter. He looked at the photo one more time. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he closed the Yearbook gently, placed it on the nightstand, and sat in the dark. This book should have meant nothing. It was a high school yearbook from 20 years ago, sitting in a cardboard box in a house in Ohio. It should have been nothing more than a relic, a sad artifact from the last year of his daughter's normal life. But instead, it had just raised every single question Raymond Calloway had ever asked, and a few he hadn't yet thought to ask. He did not sleep that night. By 4 in the morning, he was at the kitchen table with a yearbook open in front of him, a yellow legal pad beside it, his reading glasses on. He had written 3 things at the top of the page. Ellen Marsh. Senior class. 1985 to 86. And then he had stared at those words before writing a 4th. Same face. He crossed out the question mark. At 7:30 he called Hawick Senior High School. It was still operating, still in the same building, though it had undergone significant renovations in the 1990s and had a new administration. He reached a secretary who was helpful in the way school staff are before they understand what they are being asked. Raymond explained that he was trying to locate records of a student named Ellen Marsh who he believed had been enrolled in the 1985 to 86 school year, the senior class. He explained, carefully and without melodrama, that he had reason to believe this student's enrollment might be connected to a missing persons case. The secretary said she would need to speak with the principal. Nobody called him back that day. He called again the next morning. He was transferred twice, and then the call dropped. He drove to the school. He sat in the principal's office, a man named Dr. James Whitfield, organized and professionally cautious, and he put the 2 photographs on the desk side by side. He watched Whitfield look at them. He watched Whitfield's expression go through several careful adjustments. Whitfield said he would do his best to locate records related to Ellen Marsh but needed to be transparent. Records from the early and mid-1980s had been inconsistently preserved through multiple administrative transitions and a partial records room flood in 1993 that had damaged or destroyed a significant portion of paper archives from that era. Raymond asked specifically, was there any enrollment record for a student named Ellen Marsh in the 1985 to 86 school year? Whitfield went to check the physical archives stored in a basement room. He came back 4 to 5 minutes later with a thin folder and an expression Raymond couldn't entirely read. The folder contained a partial enrollment card. It had a name, E. Marsh, a grade level and a homeroom designation. No home address. No parent or guardian information. No date of birth. No social security number, which should have been standard enrollment documentation by 1985. This is incomplete, Whitfield said. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable. This level of incompleteness would not have been standard procedure even for that period. A 17 or 18-year-old enrolling as a senior would have required considerably more documentation than this. Raymond asked whether there were any other records, transcript, attendance rolls, anything confirming the student had actually been present. Whitfield returned to the basement. He was gone for over an hour. When he came back, his expression was different in a way that Raymond had learned, over decades, to read. It was the expression of someone who has found something they weren't expecting and is not yet sure what it means. He had located partial attendance rolls for the homeroom assigned to Ellen Marsh, room 22, under a teacher named Mrs. Bauer. The rolls for September and part of October 1985 were intact. The name E. Marsh appeared. Present, 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 absent, present, present. And then, in late October 1985, the name stopped appearing entirely. It didn't reappear for the rest of the year. She was here, Raymond said quietly. Or someone using that name was here. Whitfield looked at him carefully. Mr. Calloway, he said, I think you should contact the police about this. Raymond drove home and called the Hawick Police Department before he had even taken his coat off. The more questions he asked over the following days, of school administrators, of the district records office, of former teachers he tracked down through phone directories, the more he encountered not answers but the absence of answers. Not hostility, mostly, but the particular resistance of records that were incomplete, of institutional memories broken by time and transition, and the ordinary entropy of paper in basements. Former students from the class of 1986 whom he reached by phone remembered a girl named Ellen Marsh only vaguely, if at all. She had been quiet, one woman recalled, kept to herself, hadn't been there very long, hadn't left much of an impression. One former classmate, a man named Gary Thorne who had been in room 22 homeroom, said something that Raymond wrote down and stared at for a long time afterward. I remember thinking she looked like someone I knew, like she reminded me of someone, but I couldn't figure out who. Something had been erased, or something had never fully been there. Raymond contacted the Hawick Police Department Cold Case Unit on a Friday afternoon in late October 2005, and he was careful about how he did it. 20 years of navigating bureaucracy and institutional skepticism had taught him things. He didn't lead with emotion. He didn't lead with a photograph comparison. He asked to meet with whoever currently handled cold cases within the department. The answer was a detective named Sarah Mouton, mid-30s, sharp, new to the cold case unit which had only been formally established a few years earlier as part of a statewide initiative. Raymond liked her almost immediately, which surprised him. He had not liked or trusted a police officer in connection with this case in a very long time. Mouton listened to everything. She looked at the photographs. She looked at the enrollment records. She did not dismiss him. She also did not, he noticed, tell him he was onto something. She was careful in the way competent investigators are careful, non-committal, gathering information before forming conclusions. She said she would pull the original case file on Melissa. Raymond drove home and began constructing, on the legal pad that now had 23 pages of notes, the theories that had been assembling themselves in his mind. The first theory was the one that required the least explanation and that Raymond forced himself to write down first out of a commitment to honesty. Ellen Marsh was simply a girl who looked like Melissa. A coincidence. A resemblance. It happened. Faces were not as unique as we sometimes imagined, and grief was a powerful distorting lens. He wrote this theory at the top of the page. Then he wrote below it, if so, why are her records almost completely missing? The second theory was one Raymond had encountered, over years of research into missing persons cases, more often than most people realized. Identity displacement. A teenager removed from her family, through abduction, through some form of illegal placement, given a new name, enrolled in a new school under false documentation, beginning a constructed new life under someone else's identity. In the 1980s, before computerized record systems became standard, before the kinds of cross-referencing that are routine today, this was considerably more achievable than it would be now. A 17-year-old girl, old enough to understand what was happening but perhaps not in a position to do anything about it, enrolled in a high school 3 miles from her own home, photographed for the Yearbook, present in homeroom, while her parents drove every street in Hawick looking for her. The proximity was almost unbearable to sit with. 3 miles. The third theory was institutional, darker, and more complicated. Raymond had learned, in his years of research, that some teenagers in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly those from families who lacked the resources or connections to mount sustained pressure on official systems, had been placed in informal or unregulated arrangements that existed in a legal gray zone. Not official foster care, not adoption, something less supervised, less documented, operating through private networks that left deliberately incomplete paper trails. Children and teenagers who entered these arrangements sometimes ceased, from a bureaucratic standpoint, to be who they had been. Raymond did not want to think about this theory in detail. He thought about it constantly. He called Detective Mouton on Monday morning. She told him something that made him close his eyes and stand very still in his kitchen. The original case file on Melissa contained a detail, a note written by Detective Dutton the first week of the investigation, that Raymond had never been told about. A neighbor 2 streets over, a woman named Patricia Horn, who had long since moved away, had reported seeing a teenage girl matching Melissa's description getting into a car on Cloverdale Road on the morning of August 14th. A white or light-colored sedan. She had not thought it alarming at the time because the girl had appeared to get in voluntarily. No distress, no hesitation, no sign of a struggle. Dutton had followed up with Patricia Horn once. He had recorded her account. And then, in Mootown's careful language, the lead had been deprioritized. Raymond stood in his kitchen for a moment. Someone saw her get into a car, he said. On the morning she disappeared. And that was deprioritized. That's what the file shows, Mouton said. Who decided not to ask the next question? Raymond said. Detective Mouton was quiet for a moment. That, she said, is something I'm looking into. The forensic examination of the Yearbook, conducted by Detective Mouton with the assistance of a document examiner brought in from the Columbus field office, took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Raymond existed in a state that was both more alive and more fragile than anything he had felt in years. He slept badly. He ate at irregular hours. He drove past Harwick Senior High School twice, not because there was any practical reason to, but because he couldn't help himself. He sat in the parking lot both times and looked at the same building, renovated but structurally the same, and thought about a girl named Ellen Marsh sitting in room 22. Present, 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 absent, present, gone. The document examiner's name was Howard Selby. He was methodical, thorough, and communicated primarily through written reports, which suited Raymond fine. He had no interest in personality. He was interested in facts. Selby's report arrived in the first week of December 2005. Detective Mouton called Raymond to come in and discuss it. He drove to the station on a gray morning. He sat across from Mouton with the report on the table between them, and she walked him through it carefully, section by section. The first finding, the Yearbook was authentic. A genuine Harwick Senior High School yearbook from the 1985 to 86 school year, produced by the school's contracted yearbook company. The paper, the printing, the binding, all consistent with the production date. Nothing about the physical book itself had been tampered with. The second finding, the photograph identified as Ellen Marsh, showed evidence, at the microscopic level, of having been submitted separately from the other student photographs in the senior class section. There were subtle inconsistencies in the photographic paper quality, suggesting the print had been produced at a different time or place than the surrounding photos, then physically incorporated into the layout before the book went to print. This was not technically impossible. Yearbook production in 1985 involved physical assembly of layouts before printing. But it was unusual because every other photograph in the senior section appeared to have been taken by the school's contracted photographer during the same scheduled photo day in September. Ellen Marsh had not been photographed with her class. Her photo had been submitted separately and inserted into the layout. The third finding, the name Ellen Marsh appeared nowhere in the school district's administrative records beyond the partial enrollment card and the partial attendance rolls. No transcript. No report cards. No records of extracurricular participation. No records of any kind that would represent a student's complete year in a school system. The fourth finding, the one that made Raymond grip the arms of his chair, was this. Howard Selby had located the original photographic negative corresponding to the Ellen Marsh portrait through the Yearbook contractor's archive. The contractor was a small, family-owned operation that had stored their production archives in climate-controlled conditions for decades, primarily for tax purposes. On the negative frame, in the coded notation that photographers used for client identification, was a sequence that Selby cross-referenced with the contractor's ledger. That code corresponded not to the school's scheduled photo session. It corresponded to a roll of film submitted anonymously, paid for in cash, delivered to the contractor's processing lab in September 1985, accompanied by a handwritten note identifying the enclosed photograph as being for Hawick Senior High School Yearbook, Senior Class, Student Ellen Marsh. Someone had paid, in cash, to have this specific photograph inserted into the senior section of Hawick High School's official yearbook for 1985-86. Someone had known how the yearbook contractor operated, known the submission process, and used that knowledge to place a photograph of this girl, this specific girl, into the school's permanent record for that year. Raymond sat in Detective Mootown's office, and the room was very quiet. He said, "Someone was trying to build a paper trail." Mootown nodded slowly. "Or they were trying to establish an identity with institutional backing," she said. "Get her in the school. Get her in the yearbook. Give her a documented presence. The problem is the rest of the documentation was never completed, or it was removed. And then whoever was doing this stopped. The name disappears from attendance in late October 1985. The enrollment record is essentially empty. The yearbook photo was the only piece of the plan that survived, because once it went to print, it couldn't be taken back." Raymond thought about that. A cover-up plan, abandoned or interrupted, leaving behind a single artifact that was impossible to retrieve once it had been distributed to students across the school. What made them stop? Raymond asked. "We don't know yet," Mootown said. "But we're going to find out." The investigation into the identity of Ellen Marsh, into who had submitted that photograph in cash, who had enrolled a teenager under that name, who had been driving a white or light-colored sedan on Cloverdale Road on the morning of August 14, 1985, was formally reopened as an active investigation in December 2005, 20 years after Melissa Calloway walked out of her house on Cloverdale Road for the last time. The investigation took 2 more years. That is not the answer anyone wants to hear. These stories carry an expectation built into them, that the discovery becomes the key opens the door, and justice walks through cleanly and completely. Life does not reliably organize itself that way. Truth, when it emerges from 20 years of burial, tends to come out slowly, in fragments, assembled by patient and persistent people who are willing to sit with incompleteness and keep working. In 2006, Detective Mootown located Patricia Horn, who had moved to Tennessee after her husband's retirement and who was now in her 70s, but whose memory of that August morning on Cloverdale Road had not faded the way one might have expected. She remembered a white Oldsmobile. She remembered the girl getting in without hesitation. And she remembered something she had told Dutton at the time, something that had not made it into his recorded notes. There had been a woman visible in the front seat. The woman had not gotten out of the car. She had turned and looked toward Patricia from across the street, and then the car had driven away. Patricia described a woman in her 30s or 40s with dark hair. Nothing more specific. But the detail that Patricia kept returning to, that she had always returned to in the years since, was how the girl had gotten into the back seat. The way you get into the back seat of a car driven by someone you know. Natural. Unhurried. Like she had done it 100 times. She didn't look scared, Patricia Horn told Mootown. That's what I always told myself. She didn't look scared. So I didn't think anything of it. That's what I've had to live with. She didn't look scared. In 2007, a cold case genealogist working with Mootown's unit traced the enrollment card for E. Marsh to a Hawick address that had been given verbally during the school registration. The address on Fenwick Street belonged, in 1985, to a woman named Dorothy Marsh. Dorothy Marsh had died in 1999. She had no children, but she had a sister who had lived briefly in Hawick in the mid-1980s before moving to Michigan. The sister's name was Janet Fowler. Janet Fowler, located in a suburb of Detroit, was 62 years old, in poor health, and had been carrying something for more than 20 years. The full details of what Janet Fowler told investigators are part of an ongoing legal record, and not all of them are public. What is known, what Raymond Calloway knows, is this. Janet Fowler had participated in what, in the 1980s, occupied an ambiguous legal space. An informal, unregulated placement of a teenager arranged through a private intermediary, operating entirely outside any official foster care or adoption system. These arrangements, and they were not rare in certain regional networks during that era, were not always criminal in stated intent, but they were criminal in practice. They involved falsified documentation, the deliberate concealment of a young person's true identity, and the severing of that person from their family without legal process or transparency. Janet Fowler claimed she had been told the girl was a voluntary placement, that her family had agreed, that everything had been arranged through proper channels, even though nothing had been documented in any official system. She had believed this, or she had chosen to believe it, which was a distinction Mouton noted carefully in her reports. Fowler had enrolled the girl at Harwick High under the name Ellen Marsh. She had been in the process of building a more complete false identity, social security records, a fuller paper trail, when the arrangement collapsed. The intermediary, she said, had disappeared. Communication ceased, and Janet Fowler, frightened, had contacted the intermediary's associate and told them she could not continue. The girl had been taken away in late October 1985. Taken, and not returned to her family. To whom she had been taken, Janet Fowler said she did not know with certainty. She described an intermediary, a man, no name offered, never a name, just a man, who had organized and managed the placement and who had collected the girl when the arrangement ended. She claimed not to know what happened after that. That man has never been identified. Melissa Calloway has never been found. Detective Mouton told Raymond everything she could tell him in a meeting in early 2008. She was careful and thorough and genuinely kind, and when she finished, Raymond sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "She was alive." In October 1985, she was still alive. Mouton said yes. Based on all available information, she believed so. Raymond looked down at the table. Somewhere in the building a phone was ringing. Someone's shoes squeaked against the hallway floor outside the closed door. The ordinary world continuing at its ordinary pace. She was 3 miles away, Raymond said. Not a question. Something else. A fact that had a physical weight to it. A fact that landed in the chest and stayed. Mouton didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Raymond Calloway drove home through the gray streets of Harwick, and he sat in the kitchen of the house on Cloverdale Road. The same house. He had never left. He could never have explained adequately why he had never left. And he thought about a 17-year-old girl getting into the back seat of a white Oldsmobile without hesitation. He thought about what it meant that she hadn't hesitated. He thought about who she might have believed she was getting in with. He thought about 6 weeks on Fenwick Street, 3 miles away, sitting in a homeroom called Room 22 under a name that wasn't hers. He thought about late October 1985. Present. 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 Gone. The case of Melissa Calloway remains technically open. No person has ever been charged with her abduction. Janet Fowler was investigated but ultimately not prosecuted, in part due to her age and declining health, in part due to the legal ambiguities governing the arrangement she described, in part due to the absence of surviving documentation that would meet the evidentiary burden required for prosecution. She died in 2011. Whatever she had not yet told investigators died with her. The intermediary, the man who organized the placement, who drove away with Melissa in the fall of 1985, whose identity Janet Fowler claimed she could not clearly provide, remains unidentified. The wider network of informal illegal placements that Mouton's investigation suggested may have operated in the region during the 1980s was never fully mapped or prosecuted. Raymond Calloway is in his early 80s now. He still lives on Cloverdale Road. His daughter's room is kept the way it always was, not as a shrine, not frozen in 1985, but maintained. The bed made, her books on the shelf, the journal he never read, still on the nightstand where he placed it years ago, still unread, because he decided a long time ago that her private thoughts belonged to her and that his love for her did not override that. The Yearbook is on his own bookshelf now. He keeps it there not as a torture device and not as an obsession but as what it actually is, proof. The accidental record of something true that someone tried very deliberately to bury. Whoever submitted that photograph in cash, in September 1985, whatever their full plan was, they created the one artifact that would survive intact for 20 years and pull a cold case back into the light. Once the book was printed and distributed, it could not be recalled. It sat in boxes and on shelves all across Harwick for 2 decades, in houses where former students kept their yearbooks the way people keep yearbooks. For the faces, for the signatures, for the version of themselves captured in a particular moment. It sat in a cardboard box labeled in Carol Calloway's handwriting, in a room that still smelled faintly of the lavender soap her daughter had used. Waiting. Raymond Calloway found it on a Tuesday evening because he couldn't sleep and his hands needed something to do, and because he was, above all and after everything, her father. Detective Sarah Mouton, who retired from the Harwick Police Department in 2019, still thinks about the case. She said in a 2020 interview with a regional publication, "There is no clean resolution here. There is no arrest, no trial, no sentence that gave this family what they deserved. But there is something. There is a documented fact that a girl who was erased from the official record left one trace, a photograph in a yearbook, that her father found 20 years later because he never once accepted the easy explanation. Every family in this situation, every parent who is told to accept the official narrative and move on, should know that Raymond Calloway refused to do that. And he was right to refuse. His persistence is what gave this case a second life. The yearbook was the thread, but he was the one who kept the thread alive long enough to pull it. Some cases don't end with justice, but they still deserve the truth. Melissa Ann Calloway was born on June 4, 1968. She was 17 years old when she walked down Cloverdale Road on a summer morning in 1985 with a notebook in her canvas bag and the whole of her senior year ahead of her. She wanted to study journalism. She kept a folder in her desk drawer comparing university programs. She had a gap between her front teeth that she had decided was interesting. She made everyone around her feel like the world was more interesting than they had realized. She has never been found, but she has not been forgotten. And the father who refused to forget her found, in a dusty cardboard box on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the proof that he was right to remember. What would you have done in Raymond's position? Would you have kept looking for 20 years? Do you believe this case was ever truly investigated the way it deserved to be? Some stories stay open, but all of them, every single one, deserve someone willing to sit with an old yearbook and ask the question no one else was still asking. Melissa Ann Calloway, born June 4, 1968. Last seen August 14, 1985. Still missing. Subscribe for more stories like this.